Welcome to Chess Understanding. I'm chess expert John Montgomery. In this video, we're going to focus on some of those King's Indian strategies that we've looked at in action, in actual games being used by some of the best players in the world. And as you watch this video, be sure to comment on your own experiences playing the King's Indian defense. And if you see anything interesting in the video that you would like to comment on, please do. Like and subscribe to the video, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, now we're going to look at a practical game that deals with some of the theory we've looked at. The first game we're going to look at is Gligorich-Najdorf, Mar del Plata, 1953. This is where the variation and the opening structure gets its name. This wasn't the first time that this had been played, but Gligorich sort of perfected it. The ideas that he uses in this game are as relevant today as they were in 1953. There's a lot to be learned here. Let's take a look. We begin with the classical King's Indian moves: d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, knight f3, castles, bishop e2. Black plays e5, and after castling, knight to c6. Gligorich was not the first person to play this move. I believe that was Aronin in 1950, not to be confused with Aronian, the current super GM, who I imagine was not born in 1950. But Gligorich would put his stamp on it here very soon. d5, kicking the knight and gaining space, knight to e7, knight e1, and of course the idea here is to maneuver the knight to the d3 square, and from that square help control c5. Black responds with knight to d7. That clears the way for the f5 pawn to advance and also adds some defensive control over the c5 square. Knight d3, f5, f3, and now f4. This is the first of the two plans we looked at. Black is playing to break on the g4 square with this pawn. He's created a new base of the pawn chain by playing f4. This f3 square is the new base of the pawn chain. Bishop d2, knight to f6, and this is Gligorich's new idea. Before this move, Black would play g5, which Gligorich will play, but then play the rook to f6 and h6 and attack down this file. And this idea, even today, can be played occasionally, but it isn't as effective as Gligorich's idea, which we will see. Knight to f6, b4. Might have been better for white to play c5 immediately, but he's trying to prepare this push to c5. g4, prepping. c5 is played. h5, and you can see the build-up around this g4 square. Everything sort of revolving on the king side around this square. Black is going to maneuver his pieces so that he's preparing to play g4 with black, with the pawn at g5, this move. But white is also going to arrange his pieces to stop it. In fact, at the point of maximum tension, black will have 5 pieces attacking the g4 square, and white will have 5 pieces and pawns defending it. The game really revolves around this square. Knight f2, the beginning of, again, adding to the defense of this square. Knight g6. This also was a Gligorich, I believe, invention. This knight has quite a bit of potential. It can go to the h5 square. But Gligorich uses a maneuver that's really quite creative, which we'll see later with this knight. That is, again, as valid today as it was then. Rook to c1. White's preparing to penetrate, exchange on d6, and then penetrate down the c file. Rook f7. Now this is a very important move. It does two things. One, it helps protect the c7 square, which is a key point of penetration for white. It also prepares to move the rook to the g7 square, which then supports the g4 push after this bishop moves to f8. So this idea of rook to f7, g7, and bishop to f8 is very common in this position. The reason it's so effective is it helps defend the d6 pawn and also helps prepare the g4 push. White continues by taking the pawn, opening up the file. a4 expanding on the queen side. Bishop f8, again continuing this maneuver and adding some extra defense to this d6 pawn. Rook to g7. So this switching of the rook at f8 and the bishop on g7 is complete, and they found ideal squares. h3, contributing to the defense of the g4 square. And if you look at this, white actually has 5 pieces and pawns defending this square. This queen, this bishop, this knight, the f3 pawn, and the h3 pawn are all contributing to defending the g4 square. Black, at the moment, only has 3 pieces and pawns directly attacking it, but this rook indirectly presses down on it, and then black will be adding a 5th piece by using this very creative maneuver of the knight at g6, which will go to h8, f7, then h6. And by doing that, he will actually have 5 pieces and pawns preparing to play g4 with sort of a tense standoff going on around this key square. Maneuver begins. Knight b5, wanting to pressure c7 and d6. Black goes ahead and plays g4. One thing that's important to notice is when this pawn at f3 goes away, the pawn at e4 will no longer be defended by a pawn, and the knight at f2 is the only piece defending it, and it could become overloaded. And Gligorich takes a big advantage of that, and he puts a lot of pressure on e4 as part of his attack. He sort of uses an attack on e4 to help maneuver his pieces into their best attacking position against the white king. Capture, capture. a6, knight a3, bishop d7, knight to c4. Aiming for the b6 square, white would love to play the knight to b6, forking this rook and this bishop, and when white moves the rook, he takes the bishop. We talked in the other video about how incredibly valuable this light squared bishop is for black, and black wants to preserve it at all costs. Take exchange on c1. And now, a very important point. If you look at this knight on b6, it looks like a beautiful piece. It's on a weak square. It cannot be kicked out by another pawn. The b6 square is very weak. The knight is supported by a pawn, and it's on the 6th rank. So by any normal measure, this is an incredibly powerful piece. The problem is it's sort of the phrase all dressed up with nowhere to go comes to mind. While it looks good, what is it attacking? What does it do? The fact of the matter is black would love to be able to trade off this knight for this light squared bishop. We've talked about how important this bishop is. Gligorich knows this, and he would much rather have white keep that knight on b6 and preserve this bishop. So his next move does that. Bishop to e8. And he wants to protect that bishop at all costs. It's needed in the attack. Bishop to a3, perhaps preparing some x-ray pressure on d6. Knight f7, queen c2, knight h6. So the maneuver is completed, and now black has pressure on g4 that basically, there's very little white can do to protect it at this point. So he plays g5. The idea is, he says, I'm going to lose it anyway. At least I can deflect this rook away from its defense of the c7 square. So at least I get a little something out of it, is the idea. Rook takes g5. Rook to c1, preparing to penetrate along the c file and enter the c7 square. Rook to g3, indirectly attacking this bishop, as you see here. The bishop moves, so it doesn't get captured. And the knight comes in. And the queen now has an opening to any of these squares to the king side. Knight takes, 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 takes. And at this point, white sees that his king side is in big trouble, and he just goes ahead and plays queen to f2, hoping to stop the pressure, but he probably has no way to stop it at this point. Bishop g6. Remember, I told you about this weak pawn here. This bishop is attacking it, and this becomes a big problem for white to deal with. Rook to c4, defending the pawn. Queen e7. Now, at first this move might look a bit slow. You know, why not just come into a square like g5 and just put a lot of pressure? But his idea is to play the queen here, which adds to the attack on e4. And then he can play down the h file. Bishop c3. Again, piling on the pressure on this pawn. White defends it. Then rook h4, penetrating down the h file. White is in big trouble. King f2, f3 exclamation point. Any way white captures this pawn, he's toast. If he takes with this pawn, then the rook goes here and skewers the king against the queen. If he takes with the king, the bishop comes here, skewering this way. And if he takes with the queen, then the rook comes here, pinning the queen to the king. A really nasty situation, a very destructive move from black. But when you have a strong position, these kind of moves come much more naturally. Queen e3, rook f4, pawn takes, queen h2 check, and now it's basically just a pretty clear mating process. Not saying mate is forced here, but the attack is irresistible. King e1, check, check. Threatening the f3 pawn. King over. Rook takes pawn. Black knows that while white's going to get a check on g5, once he blocks with this bishop, there won't be anything white can do to the black king. Check, 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 and check. And I believe mate is completely forced at this point. White resigned here. One particular mating pattern that black has, if white goes to king to d3, you can check with this bishop. And if king e3, check, king takes, queen f1, checkmate. So that is a good example of how to execute the attack when you go ahead and play f4 and you lock the structure. And the maneuvers Gligorich used in this game are played to this very day. If you learn those maneuvers, particularly the knight maneuver of knight h6, f7, h6, also the arrangement of the rook and bishop, rook f7, bishop f8, rook g7, the preservation of that light squared bishop. All of these themes are timeless and very, very important when playing this attacking structure in the King's Indian. Now we move to the second game, and this shows the strategy, the second strategy we looked at with black, where instead of locking the structure with f4, he or she takes on e4 and plays the knight to f5. And this is a much more current game, played in the last 10 years, and the player with the black pieces is none other than Anish Giri. Now, people joke about Giri being a draw artist. He gets a lot of draws, but that's when he's playing against the best players in the world, the very, very elite top 20 in the world. But against everyone else, he has a tendency to win and not draw, and this is a good example of that. His opponent here is Olivier René. Okay, so here we have Giri and René. We have our starting moves for the classical King's Indian: e5, castle, knight c6, d5, knight e7, knight e1, knight d7, knight d3. Same moves as Gligorich-Najdorf. Black plays f5. Here white plays bishop to d2. Black does not want to play f4 just yet because the pawn is not on f3, and white would be able to get the bishop out on g4 if black were to play f4. So Giri decides to take on e4. Knight f6 is probably the most common move here, but he decides to change things up a bit. He takes on e4, white recaptures. Now, after playing knight f5, there's a very important thing to note here. White has a good square on e4, and he would love to create an impenetrable and unstoppable blockade on this square. He wants to control e4 in such a way that black can never contest it. He'd love to be left with a knight on that square. And if he wants to do that, he should get started right away. He shouldn't waste any time. White should immediately play f3, maneuver this knight to f2, and then maybe the bishop can go to d3. And he shouldn't waste any time. He should start that maneuver immediately. Instead, he plays rook to c1, which is a general move. It does support this advance to c5, but it isn't precise enough in this position. It's sort of a general move instead of a precise move. So Giri immediately plays knight f6, challenging the e4 square, not wasting any time. Bishop g5, he wants to trade off this knight. What white is thinking is that if he can trade off this bishop for this knight, then he will be left with 3 minor pieces, all of which can control e4. You have 2 knights and a light squared bishop. Whereas black will be left with, let's clean this up a little bit. Black would be left with this bishop, this knight, and this bishop. Now only 2 of these pieces can directly control or contest e4, the knight and the bishop. The dark squared bishop cannot directly contest it. So the idea of playing bishop g5 does make some sense. h6, bishop f6, bishop f6, bishop g4. White would love for black to move this knight on f5 and trade light squared bishops, but black has no intention of doing that. b6 wants to slow down this advance, which is still a good idea for white in this structure. Rook to c3. I'm not really exactly sure what white's doing. Again, that's typically a good square for a rook for white in a King's Indian, controlling that 3rd rank. It's just not very precise here. This maneuver a5 just makes white's queenside play even slower. It slows white down. Knight e1. I think what he's trying to do here, he wants to contest this knight on f5 by maybe doing something like this with the knight. It also clears the path for the rook. Bishop g7. Gary wants to play h5 and then get the bishop on the h6 square. Knight c2, h5, bishop h3, bishop h6, rook e1, king h7, knight to g3, wants to, again, trying to work on this knight on f5, queen to g5. Now you notice black's pieces are slowly but surely inching closer and closer to white's king and amassing on the king side, and white's queenside play hasn't even gotten started yet. It never really does get started. Rook f3, bishop d7, b3. This is at least the beginning of some queenside play, beginning the doubling on the half-open file. Rook e4, rook a f8. So now black's pieces are all very well placed, all aiming at the king side. The only thing, and Giri will do this, is that he'll decide that his key to activity is advancing this pawn, so the queen is sort of in the way of that, so he'll move the queen out of the way so he can play g5. Rook e1, queen e7, knight back to e4, bishop f4. He wants to play g5, and he can't do that immediately before the bishop goes to f4 because white would just take, if black plays g5, white would just take twice on f5, sacking the exchange, but at the end he would be able to grab this h5 pawn, and even though he's down the exchange, his minor pieces are beautiful, and white would be in good shape in that position. So by playing the bishop to f4, he makes it impossible to exchange this knight off twice. He blocks the rook's path here. The rook moves away, opening up the queen to put pressure on this pawn. Again, stopping the g5 push. Bishop back to h6. It's no longer needed on f4. Rook f3. And here, if Giri had played the bishop back to f4, white would probably be very happy with a draw. But Giri wants to play on. He likes his position. Plays queen e8. This indirectly defends the h5 pawn after some exchanges. And again, everything he's doing is to try to get this g5 push in. White's trying to prevent it. Queen e8 protects h5, and that makes it possible. a4. This is probably a bad move. White wants to keep the pawns flexible on the queen side, and it will be much easier to get queenside play if he had played the pawn to a3 and then played this pawn to b4. But also, now black can go ahead and play g5 like he's wanted to play all along. g5, take, knight to g3, bishop g6, take. So here we have black's position. He has two beautiful bishops and pressure on the king side. He can be very happy with this position. f3, that gives black a hook to open up the king side by playing g4. And now black's position rolls very, very effectively here. Rook f1, king h8. This may seem like a strange move, but Giri is actually planning to move the queen to h7, just like Gligorich did in his game. Now, Gligorich was attacking a pawn on e4. Here he's controlling a very valuable diagonal and creating all kinds of threats on the light squares. But it is interesting, this maneuver. I wonder if Giri got this idea from the game that Gligorich played many, many years earlier. Queen e2, queen h7, Knight e1 passive, but what is white going to do? h4, sacrificing a pawn to completely dominate the dark squares around black's king. See all these weak squares here. Bishop f4, check. e4 wants to open up this line of attack against the king with the rook. Rook g1. Now the X-ray pressure is against the queen. King back, take. Queen to b2 check. King to h7. And here white resigns. If he tries to play knight f3, then check, king f2 check, and black wins everything. The game is completely over at this point. So this is a good example from the black side of the second plan that we looked at of capturing on e4 instead of advancing to f4. It's a faster plan. It's not quite as potent but if black doesn't have time to play f4, this is a very good plan, and Geary, of course, executed it to perfection. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're looking for a place to help teach you how to understand chess, be sure to subscribe.